look at North Dakota, rapid development, and then pretty sizable decline here. Okay, so here's what's going on. What's going on in around 2013, 2014 is there is a oil price war. Okay, the oil price war exists because there are a small number of especially important oil producers, OPEC among them. And in and around 2013, 2014, OPEC, and then what is later called OPEC Plus, which includes Russia. So Russia has sort of around this time period joined in with the other OPEC countries, mostly Middle Eastern countries, some Central and South American countries as well. Venezuela, for example, is a member of OPEC. Venezuela is another great example of the resource curse, by the way. Venezuela's economy still is yet to recover from this price war that we're describing. So that's another country to consider that has rapidly declined in the face of this oil price war, regardless. So around 2014, 2013, we have what is an oil price war. So what is an oil price war? Well, an oil price war is just a rapid increase in the supply of a product, right? Rapid increase in the supply of a product. So if we look, for example, right, this is just a hypothetical market equilibrium for some, product, right? If supply increases, that is this graph here to the right, or I'm sorry, that is this graph here to the left, and that causes supply curve to shift out in this direction, right? So this would be a supply increase. And so what's going on in the price war is that OPEC, which has a outsized role in the price of oil because they control so much of the supply of oil globally, they flood the market with oil. Okay, they flood the market with oil. This causes a dramatic increase in the supply of oil, and this pushes the price of oil downward. Okay, this pushes the price of oil downward. In fact, if you just look at crude oil prices over the last 70 years, let's focus on this time period. You'll see right here when the price war starts, dramatic decline in the price of oil, right? Dramatic decline in the price of oil. Notice that the Great Recession caused a dramatic decline. This is from demand decreasing. But here's your price war here. And by the way, you see the price decline right at the beginning of COVID. Although I'll mention that we're currently, we prior to COVID, there was another price war. And we'll talk about that. But here's definitely the price war. So as the price of oil plummets, this means those areas that are reliant upon the sale of oil for the benefit of their economic system, North Dakota, Nigeria, Russia, this is why their economic prospects decline. This is why their GDP per capita declined. So because they tied themselves so much economically to those particular resources, we see the decline of their economic prospects right in line with the decline in oil prices. I mean, you can see it, right? So 2014, oil prices decline. 2014, North Dakota GDP declines. 2014, GDP of Nigeria declines. And we already saw the Russia one, right? So what this tells us, and we'll go back to the graph here, and again, this right here is the supply. So when the price of a resource declines, if you're a country that economically benefits from that resource, you are going to experience economic destruction, which is the way it works. That's the problem of the risk of undiversifying your portfolio, of putting all of your economic eggs into one basket. But the problem is that there's so much of an incentive to do this. North Dakota, for example, knew that they had a lot of oil for a long time, but it was expensive oil. It was oil that was expensive to extract. So it wasn't until the price of oil rose considerably that it was economically profitable to dig that oil out of North Dakota. And so there's already a dependence upon a particular oil price for North Dakota oil fields to be profitable. And as soon as that price decline occurred because of the price war between OPEC and US domestic oil producers, there went the economic prospects of North Dakota. Now, of course, you'll notice, you probably already noticed this, but there was, of course, this steady increase in the price of oil from the end of 2015 all the way through 2018. So if you'll notice there, we go back and we see, well, that's when North Dakota's prospects started to improve again. So in many respects, what North Dakota has done, what Nigeria has done, and what Russia has done is they have made their economic prospects, their social prospects, reliant upon the price of oil, the price of a resource. By the way, the price of a resource that in many parts of the world we are trying to move away from. Right, rapid development of electric vehicles in the U.S., rapid development of hybrid vehicles for the last 15 years, has caused a sensible, reflection by a lot of oil and natural gas companies at what the future is going to look like. Right, how long will it remain profitable to dig up North Dakota oil? Right, well, that kind of remains to be seen. But we see this resource curse play out. And the reason why this is so important in the context of resources is that, as we've talked about in class, whether this is a tragedy of the commons situation where we're overfishing a fishery, allowing animals to overgraze, or pulling up so much oil out of the ground that we eventually exhaust it as a resource, and we've put all our economic eggs into that basket, and so there's nothing left for us to glean from it. We know that the market doesn't recognize these problems, right? There's nothing about the market that will reallocate resources away from the resource. Only humans can choose to do that. And if states and countries are actively doing the opposite, they're actively giving their economic prospects a non-diversified portfolio, then it really becomes no surprise at all that when those markets begin to decline, that we see those declines in those particular places. So now let's go back to the oil price war for a moment, and let's talk about why it happened, and not just why it's happened, but why it continues to happen. So let's see here. Nope. Where is it? So this is an article that was written this year, which talks about another oil price war. This time, though, the oil price war is between Russia and OPEC. So previously, I had mentioned that Russia was a part of something they now refer to as OPEC Plus. And the idea behind OPEC Plus was it was sort of OPEC plus Russia. Well, that sort of agreement fell out a little bit earlier this year, and so Russia stopped, doing the things that OPEC was guiding it to do. Now, the way that OPEC wields its power is that it has essentially a control on about half the global oil reserve. They control it. So if they want to flood the market with supply and push the price down, they can do that. If they want to pull back on the supply to push the price up, they can do that, right? This is a market failure, right? If you took Economics 106, we refer to this as monopoly power, and we know that we call monopoly power a market failure. And what ends up happening in these situations is that because OPEC has this outsized influence on the price of oil, the price of oil doesn't behave the way we would expect to. It doesn't behave efficiently, right? And so not only are places like North Dakota, Nigeria, and Russia putting all their economic eggs into one basket, but they're doing so specifically into an economic industry which itself is not efficiently run. It is not efficiently run. It's not in any way, shape, or form does it behave the way we would expect a healthy market to behave. And it's rife with all sorts of corruption and grift and graft and environmental destruction, right? To put it succinctly, the oil industry is dirty, right? In so many ways. Okay, so let's talk about the economics of price wars a little bit, because I think that's kind of interesting, and this is how we'll wrap up this particular lecture, is to talk about, well, like, what are price wars and how do they arise? The best way to describe a price war is to refer to it as a prisoner's dilemma, and it, in many respects, is a prisoner's dilemma. And the idea behind a prisoner's dilemma is that there are circumstances in which two or more entities can come to an agreement that creates a preferable outcome than if those two individuals instead competed, right? Two or more individuals competed. So OPEC, the OPEC countries that agree to be members of OPEC, they've agreed that instead of competing with each other, they're going to act as if they are a monopolist as OPEC, right? And so Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, these member countries of OPEC, they've agreed to, instead of making decisions unilaterally, they are making decisions as a group, and this gives them market power. Okay. Well, this agreement requires trust. It requires the individuals in the agreement to behave according to the agreement. Okay. So let's give a hypothetical. Caleb and Greg have robbed a bank. Prior to robbing the bank, Caleb and Greg agreed that if they were arrested, they would not rat on each other. That is, that they would lie to the cops and they would say, of course, we didn't rob the bank. The cops, who have enough information to charge them on a lesser crime than robbing the bank, have a really strong suspicion that they, in fact, did rob the bank. And so, what the cops do is they present to them two options, right? They split them up. They put Caleb in one cell, they put Greg in another cell, and then they give them two options. Okay. You can admit to the crime or you can lie, basically. Okay. And here are the outcomes. So if they both lie to the cops, they're going to go to jail for 1 year. The cops are not going to be able to charge them on the bank robbery, but they're able to charge them for the lesser crime, and that will send them to jail for 1 year each. They can both be honest with the cops, and that is tell the cops, yes, in fact, we did rob the bank. And if they do that, they're both going to be charged and sent to jail for 5 years. Now, the more interesting outcomes are these two outcomes here. So this outcome is when Greg is honest with the cops and when Caleb lies to the cops. So Caleb says, no, we didn't do it. Greg says, yeah, we did it. Okay. The prison sentences are, the first one goes to Caleb. So in every outcome, the first one goes to Caleb. The second one goes to Greg. And so if Caleb lies while Greg is honest, he's going to go to jail for 10 years, where they're going to let Greg go free. They're going to be like, you know what? You were honest with us. Caleb was lying to us. You can go free. Okay. The same thing is true, of course, if Greg lies and Caleb is honest. Caleb's going to get 0 years in prison while Greg is going to get 10 years in prison. What this does is it causes Caleb and Greg to question their trust for each other. This is precisely, of course, what the cops want to do. They want to get in the way of the trust between Caleb and Greg, assuming that maybe they had some agreement prior to committing the crime, that they were not going to rat on each other. And so this is the game that they give to them. And by the way, Greg and Caleb know that these are the offerings given to both of them. So there's a perfect information thing. Caleb knows the game, Greg knows the game, they know the payoffs, they know how they look. All right. So they have all the information you see in front of you. All right. So let's go through this game and let's see if maybe there's a surprising result. And again, remember, Greg and Caleb robbed the bank by first creating an agreement that said they would not lie to the cops. I want you to remember that. Let's develop the strategies of the two players. So let's do the strategies for Caleb. The way that we do this is we simply ask ourselves, if Greg lies, what does Caleb want to do? If Greg lies, that means we're in one of these two outcomes. Caleb lies and goes to jail for 1 year, or he tells the truth and he goes to jail for 0 years. Pure rationality says Caleb's going to choose to be honest in that situation, meaning that if Caleb thinks Greg is going to lie to the cops, he does better by being honest. Now, on the other hand, if Greg is honest with the cops, Caleb does better by also being honest, because 5 years in prison is better than 10 years in prison. So when Greg is honest, Caleb wants to be honest. Well, we just established that when Greg lies, Caleb also wants to be honest. So what this means is that Caleb has a dominant strategy to be honest, right? Taken on its face and using a pure definition of human rationality, it is better for Caleb to always choose to be honest. Now, what sometimes students get confused about is they say, well, wait a minute, doesn't that mean that he's likely to go to jail for 5 years? Yes. But remember that there is this potential for him to go to jail for 0 years. And the only way that Greg or Caleb are going to agree to lie to the cops is if they trust each other. I'll remind you, they're bank robbers. Maybe hard to trust. We do the strategies for Greg. We get the very same outcome. As the strategies are the same, right? They're symmetric, is what we would call them. And when Caleb lies, Greg wants to be honest. And when Caleb is honest, Greg wants to be honest, right? So we call this a Nash equilibrium. It's not super important that you know what Nash equilibrium is, named after John Nash, famous mathematician. Movie A Beautiful Mind, which you may have seen, that was about John Nash. So maybe I should just say Russell Crowe in the movie A Beautiful Mind. Maybe you would know who that is. If you took my class, Economics 106, we certainly talked about Nash. The whole point of the Nash equilibrium is to show that commitments to particular agreements can break down simply because of rationality. And also to show that human rationality sometimes creates adverse outcomes. So if we look at this game on its face value, we see that both players are going to be honest with the cops. And this leads to a worse outcome than if they maintained this agreement, right? And we'll call this the collusive agreement, right? The lying to the cops we'll refer to as a collusive agreement. Now, it doesn't mean that they won't choose the collusive agreement. It could be certainly the case that Greg and Caleb trust each other so much that they maintain that collusive agreement, okay? But much like the price war that we just saw with OPEC and Russia, there are reasons to deviate from the collusive agreement, right? There are reasons that we would not expect the two countries to deviate from that particular agreement. And here's why. Let's say we have two companies. In this case, we have Osprey or Dunder Mifflin. These are two paper companies. And they have two options. They can collude with each other or they can compete with each other. If they collude with each other, that is that they behave like monopolists, they can both earn profits of $36. If they instead compete with each other, they're going to compete their profits down to $32. Of course, the more interesting outcomes are when one company, in this case, Osprey, chooses to compete while the other company chooses to collude. We can see that the colluding company only gets 30 and the competing company gets 40. Okay. Same thing is true, of course, if Dunder Mifflin chooses to compete instead of collude and Osprey chooses to collude, they would get $40 to Dunder Mifflin and only $30 for Osprey. So there is this rationality problem, which tells both companies not only is there an incentive to compete instead of to continue with the collusive agreement, that in fact one may expect that's what's going to happen. And if you expect the other player to compete, you're not going to continue with the collusive outcome. And so the collusive outcome completely breaks down. And this is the outcome that we get. Because what's interesting about the price war with Russia is that Russia knows if they help trigger a price war, this is going to be bad for their economic system, right? That colluding for Russia is in fact better than if they choose to trigger the price war. So the question is, why would Russia engage in a price war when they know that is potentially harmful to their economic system? And the reason is because for a brief moment, Russia sees that they in fact have maybe the ability to earn some profits in the meantime, and then maybe withstand the price war and come up with an agreement later on. And this is sort of something that we continue to see happen in the resource industries. Because resource industries are so important to the economic system of the countries that have those particular resources, these sorts of agreements, collusive agreements, anti-competitive agreements, are extremely like the opposite of rare. They exist in loads, and because the resource industries, the extraction industries, are so economically meaningful to those countries, the countries go along with it, right? Basically, the Russian oil companies convinced the Russian government that it would be in their long run best interest to trigger this price war against OPEC. Of course, already seen that during the last price war, that it did not work out great, right? for the Russian prospects. So it sort of remains to be seen what the current price war, if it had any effect. Of course, it coincided directly with the pandemic, so it's going to be very hard to kind of disentangle those two effects. But basically, the price war occurs because of collusive agreements are hard to maintain. Why are collusive agreements hard to maintain? Collusive agreements are hard to maintain because of the classic prisoner's dilemma that we just described. And the prisoner's dilemma says that rationality will cause players to voluntarily choose outcomes which are advantageous to them because they lack trust in the other player. So OPEC and Russia trusted each other for about 3 or 4 years after the 2014-2015 price war, but then that trust starts to become eroded, and now we're back to having a price war. It's hard to maintain trust when the trust involves a resource as economically meaningful as oil. All right, so that's going to do it for this lecture. I thought it'd be good to get into some of the economics of the resource curse. You got a little bit of game theory thrown in there. And, I hope this was enjoyable. I hope it was an enlightening. So as you're thinking about resources and you're thinking about their economic importance in conjunction with their environmental destruction, and that environmental destruction part, we didn't talk much about it, but, in all of these places, North Dakota, Nigeria, and Russia, you have large scale environmental problems directly caused by oil extraction. So beyond the lack of economic diversification that exists in those particular industries, you also have large scale environmental problems as well. And so this is the problem of resources and the way in which the economics of resources warp the decision making by countries and by policymakers. In the US, we complain about fossil fuel subsidies and the ability of the federal government to always seem to side with oil and gas companies. And the reason why is because oil and gas companies convince us that they're so important. And if we don't help them out, then it's going to be bad for our economy. But of course, the paradox is that if you make them a very, very important part of your economic system, that alone is likely to cause you economic problems beyond not helping those particular industries.